If you rode west in the late 1800s and kept your eyes low, down where wagon ruts scarred the earth, you might have noticed a plant that didn't fit the legend. Not tumbleweed, not sagebrush. Something greener, sharper at the edges, growing stubbornly where hooves and wheels had torn up the soil. It appeared along irrigation ditches, behind corrals, near rail spurs and half-built towns that hadn't even decided what they were yet. Most people passed it without a name, or with one spoken quietly. And in a land built on necessity, quiet names often traveled faster than trains. I imagine a rider coming in at dusk, boots powdered with dust, throat raw from wind and grit. The horizon is all distance and silence until the town takes shape. Wooden storefronts, a hitching rail, the soft glow of kerosene lamps. Inside the general store, supplies are stacked like promises. Flour, coffee, nails, lamp oil. Tobacco is there too sometimes. If the last shipment made it through. If the price didn't spike. If the shopkeeper thought it worth the shelf space. In parts of the frontier, tobacco could be scarce, expensive, or simply not what a man spent his pay on when winter was closing in. Out back, though, behind the stable, where the ground has been disturbed and watered, there's that other plant. It grows quickly with even a little help. It doesn't ask for much. And because it's common across so many parts of the world, it doesn't look foreign for long. On the frontier, practical solutions usually won arguments. If a plant could be used, for fiber, for medicine, or for a smoke when nothing else was available, someone would try it. That was how the West worked. Not through speeches, but through improvisation. In the stories we tell about the Old West, we hear about cattle drives, gold strikes, and lawmen whose reputations arrived ahead of them. We hear about long miles, hard weather, quick deals. What we hear less about is what grew along the margins. What sprang up where people camped, traded, and moved on. And yet those margins mattered. They were where habits formed, where small choices repeated until they hardened into culture. This is where the puzzle begins. Cannabis, by whatever name people used at the time, didn't start out as a frontier vice in American life. It had other identities first. Long before it became a headline or a punchline, it was an ordinary plant used for ordinary purposes. Cloth, rope, paper, and later, medicines sold openly in an era when pharmacy shelves looked very different from today's. In much of early American history, hemp was treated as a material, not a moral question. It was useful. It was grown. It was traded. It didn't need a myth to justify it. But the West has a way of changing meanings. Out there, names mixed as quickly as people did. Borderlands weren't just lines on a map. They were places where languages overlapped, labor moved, and soldiers, ranch hands, railroad crews, and travelers carried customs with them. In a region shaped by migration and conflict, especially after the Mexican-American War, people didn't just cross territory. They carried words. They carried songs. They carried ways of resting at the end of long days. What had once been an agricultural staple or a pharmacy ingredient could become, in some communities, a recreational habit. And then, just as quickly, a focus of suspicion. When I picture that rider again, tired, hungry, watching the town settle into night, I don't imagine him thinking he's part of a national debate. He isn't. He's thinking about tomorrow's work, the next stretch of trail, the next paycheck that might come late. The plant at the edge of town isn't a symbol yet. It's just there, growing where people have made space without really meaning to. And that's the unsettling thing about history. What begins as background can become the main story before anyone realizes it's happening. So the question that lingers is this: how did a practical plant, once tied to rope, cloth, and medicine, become linked, in the American imagination, to the rough mythology of the frontier, and later to fear, crackdowns, and national controversy? The answer isn't one moment or one villain. It's a chain of small scenes like this one, repeated over decades, until a quiet name turns into a loud argument. In a quiet archive, the American story looks less like a showdown on a dusty street and more like a supply list. Rope, canvas, sailcloth, paper, the kinds of materials a country needs before it can argue about anything else. When I trace cannabis back through early American records, I don't start with cowboys. I start with hemp, the working form of the plant, grown for fiber, not for legend. According to the account this story draws from, cannabis reached the Western Hemisphere in the 1500s, when Spaniards brought it to Chile primarily for fiber production. Not long after, it was introduced into parts of North America, where it was cultivated mainly as hemp on farms. In those early centuries, hemp wasn't treated as a controversy. It was treated as a resource. If a crop could be turned into rope, fabric, or paper, it mattered. That was the language of survival and trade, and it shaped what people planted. The timeline then moves to the English colonies. Hemp production in Virginia began early, tied directly to the Jamestown settlement. England wanted its colonies to be useful to the crown, and hemp was part of that strategy. In 1611, according to the story, Jamestown settlers brought hemp plants across the Atlantic. By 1619, King James I was urging colonists to increase production to support England's needs. The Virginia Company, which governed Jamestown, instructed landowners to grow hemp and deliver set quantities. The tone of these records is clear. Hemp wasn't optional. It was treated as a duty. When I picture that period, I don't see rows of plants as symbols. I see them as insurance. Hemp became cordage strong enough for ships. It became fabric durable enough for daily life. A colony trying to justify its existence needed exports, and hemp filled that role. In that world, growing hemp wasn't about preference. It was about pressure. You planted what the system demanded, and the system demanded materials. The story notes that cannabis farming played a major role in early American life, with hemp becoming an important crop alongside tobacco well before the American Revolution. It also states that hemp reached New England by 1629. Whether grown in large fields or small plots, the point remains the same. For a long time, Americans encountered this plant through labor. It was tied to shipping, farming, and basic manufacturing, the infrastructure of everyday life. One detail often surprises modern readers. The story states that George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon as one of his primary crops. I hold that fact carefully, because famous names can flatten history into slogans. But in context, it fits the pattern. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, hemp was widely used in the United States for rope and cloth. If you needed strong fiber, hemp made sense, and practical needs tend to leave clear traces in farm records. As the nation expanded, hemp traveled with it. According to the account, hemp cultivation began in Kentucky by 1775, and large hemp farms appeared across multiple states throughout the 1800s. That matters because it shows hemp wasn't confined to one place or one era. It moved with settlement, trade routes, and demand. Before the Civil War and long after, hemp remained tied to the unglamorous work that kept the country running. This is the foundation later debates sit on, even when people forget it. For generations, Americans knew this plant first as hemp, a crop that could be counted, harvested, bundled, and sold. It was part of the early economy, not a cultural flashpoint. And that's what makes the next turn in the story feel so abrupt. As the nation pushed deeper into the frontier, the same plant that helped build ropes and cloth began appearing in places where rules were looser, lines blurred, and meanings could change quickly. By the middle of the 1800s, cannabis already had a place in everyday American commerce, and it wasn't the one most people imagine today. In the account I'm following, it appears first in a medical setting. Bottles, tinctures, measured doses, and the calm, authoritative language of pharmacy shelves. It sits beside other remedies from an era when labels were flexible, and medical certainty often ran ahead of evidence. In that world, The plant isn't introduced as a thrill or a rebellion. It's introduced as a product, something a clerk could sell to someone looking for relief, with few alternatives and little fanfare. Then the country's momentum shifts. Roads stretch west. Rail lines cut across the map. The frontier stops being a rumor and starts becoming a destination. Towns rise quickly, sometimes faster than the laws meant to contain them. The story moves into open territory, labor camps, and border regions where people migrate for work and survival. In those places, cannabis doesn't remain tucked inside the orderly logic of a pharmacy. It slips into the rougher reality of life on the edge of expansion, where customs overlap and the same plant can carry more than one meaning. The borderlands mark a turning point. After the Mexican-American War, the Southwest isn't simply new land. It's a region where borders shift and long-standing communities suddenly find themselves living under new flags. The story connects the spread of recreational marijuana use to cross-border movement and to Mexican workers traveling into the United States for ranching, rail construction, and seasonal labor. That detail matters because it shows how habits move with people, not with ideology. A custom doesn't need permission to cross a border. It just needs a reason to survive. Texas emerges as a focal point in this shift, not because it was isolated, but because it was deeply connected by cattle trails, railroads, and labor networks that tied towns and camps together. The account describes working-class circles where marijuana use became visible, including among cowboys and laborers, and especially within communities that carried much of the region's physical work, including Mexican and African-American workers. These weren't people writing histories. They were people laying track, driving herds, building towns, and waiting to be paid. In that kind of world, anything affordable and accessible could become part of daily life, whether outsiders approved or not. Midway through this timeline, the story turns inward, towards something more personal than policy. I picture a small room at the back of a general store or camp office. A few supplies, a bandage, a bottle, a worn ledger filled with names and numbers. A worker comes in late, exhausted, hands cracked by labor, asking for something to dull what the day has done to his body. There's no speech about culture or identity, just a request and a decision by the person behind the counter. I return to that moment because it hides a moral choice in plain sight. Do you treat this person as a neighbor in need, or as a stranger whose habits make you uneasy? On the frontier, those quiet decisions could shape reputations, livelihoods, and futures. This is where pressure begins to build. By the mid-1800s, the story notes, cannabis enters wider conversations about early drug regulation. That doesn't mean there's agreement about what the plant is or what it should be. It means the country is starting to sort substances into categories: medicine, vice, danger, acceptable, unacceptable. On the frontier, those categories rarely line up cleanly with reality. People use what's available. Institutions arrive later, often long after habits have already taken root. So this part of the story marks a split. In one setting, the plant is measured and sold as a remedy. In another, it moves through labor camps and border towns as a shared practice among working people who already live under suspicion for reasons unrelated to the plant itself. And once suspicion takes hold, the story suggests, it rarely stays contained. It grows, quietly at first, then rapidly, until something ordinary and practical becomes a signal outsiders use to decide who belongs and who does not. The closer I get to the early 1900s, the more I see how quickly a story can change its tone. In the Southwest, people had lived with cannabis in different forms for years, often as something ordinary within working communities. But as the frontier era faded and government structures tightened, the same plant began to mean something else in public life. It stopped being only about private use. It became about what authorities, newspapers, and officials said it represented. One thread in that shift runs through the legend of Pancho Villa and the Mexican Revolution. Villa's name traveled north in fragments, through newspaper reports, rumors, and folk songs passed from hand to hand. In the account I'm following, marijuana appears in some of those traditions as part of troop culture and as a detail folded into the broader mythology surrounding Villa's forces. This needs to be handled carefully. Folk music and oral stories aren't court records. They don't prove precise events, but they do reveal what people repeated, what they believed, and how they tried to make sense of a chaotic moment. In that way, the story suggests marijuana became linked to an image of the borderlands that many Americans already viewed with suspicion. In the United States, that suspicion had real consequences. As migration continued and border towns expanded, marijuana became a word some officials and commentators used to make the plant sound foreign and threatening. Language mattered. Marijuana wasn't just a label, it was a framing device, one that separated the plant from its long American history of hemp farming and pharmacy use. In a country where fears about immigration were already widespread, that framing gave public anxiety something concrete to attach itself to. I picture a newspaper editor deciding what to run. He doesn't need every detail from the ground. He needs a story that grabs attention, a strange-sounding word, a frightening claim, a headline that says, "This is new, and it's coming for your town." Repeated often enough, messages like that harden into common knowledge, even when reality is far more complex. According to the account, marijuana became a target of sensational reporting and anti-immigrant stereotypes. Once that happened, the plant was no longer discussed as a crop or a medicine. It was talked about as a social danger. This is where policy begins to accelerate. Restrictions appear first at the local level, then spread across states, building momentum over time. It isn't one law in one place, it's a pattern. Local bans, state bans, and eventually, a national move that locks the framework into place. By the 1930s, the direction is unmistakable. Public fear, political pressure, and an expanding enforcement culture are all pushing the same way. In 1937, the federal government passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which the story treats as a major turning point. Instead of viewing cannabis as an agricultural product or a common medicine, the law framed it as something requiring strict control through taxation and regulation. In practice, the act pushed cannabis out of legitimate commerce and deeper into the shadows. The result wasn't just a change in law, it was a change in status for the plant and for the people associated with it. What stays with me is how much of this transformation was driven by framing. A plant once tied to rope, cloth, and pharmacy shelves became tied to fear and suspicion. A word that sounded foreign helped make something old seem newly dangerous. And the people most affected were often the same working-class communities with the least power to shape how the story was told about them. By the end of this part of the story, the Wild West has almost nothing to do with open space. The West is becoming regulated, policed, and categorized. The meaning of the plant is being rewritten by institutions that speak louder than labor camps or border towns ever could. And once that kind of rewrite takes hold, it doesn't fade easily. It becomes the starting point for decades of national debate that follow. Years after the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, the public story of cannabis looked settled on paper, but everyday life never followed paper so cleanly. Federal law, along with many state laws, treated cannabis as something to be controlled, and that approach shaped decades of policing, courtrooms, and public messaging. But the plant itself didn't vanish. People still grew it in small plots. People still passed it quietly in private spaces. And in many places, people learned to keep their opinions to themselves, because the cost of being seen the wrong way could be far higher than the plant was ever worth. What stands out, looking back over that long stretch of time, is how uneven the impact was. Policy can sound uniform when it's written in Washington, but consequences don't land uniformly. They depend on who you are, where you live, and how much power you hold. In some communities, the The risks tied to cannabis became part of daily calculation. What you say, who you trust, what you carry, where you gather. The plant stopped being just a plant. It became a measure of how safe a person felt in their own country. Then the cultural weather shifted. In the 1960s, cannabis became more visible in mainstream youth culture, on college campuses, in music, in public conversation. That visibility changed the debate, not because consensus appeared, but because distance disappeared. It's harder to dismiss something as abstract when it shows up in your own family, your own school, your own neighborhood. The argument grew louder, and the divide sharpened between those who saw cannabis as a threat and those who saw it as a personal choice or a medical question. In 1970, the federal government passed the Controlled Substances Act, placing cannabis in the strictest category under the law, defined as having no accepted medical use at the federal level and a high potential for misuse. That classification mattered. It set the framework for enforcement and research for decades. It also widened the gap between federal policy and the way many Americans were beginning to talk about cannabis in their own lives. And still, the story doesn't move in a straight line. Change begins locally. Some voters and lawmakers start separating punishment from health, and health from morality. Over time, state laws diverge. Medical programs appear in some places. Later, adult use legalization follows in others. The result is the patchwork we live with now, a country where cannabis can be legal in one state, restricted in the next, and prohibited at the federal level. That patchwork isn't just confusing. It's a reminder of how the United States often changes. Slowly, unevenly, one state, one court case, one election at a time. The product itself changes too. Cannabis in modern dispensaries, where it's legal, bears little resemblance to the rough, inconsistent plant that once grew near frontier ditches and rail lines. Today's legal market runs on testing, packaging rules, branding, finance, and regulation. It looks like an industry because, in many places, it is one. That shift matters. It pulls cannabis away from old images, cowboys, border rumors, panic headlines, and places it inside a new American reality shaped by tax revenue, consumer safety, and regulation. When I step back, though, the deeper pattern hasn't changed. Cannabis in America is never just one thing. It has been a fiber crop tied to national supply, a medicine sold openly in pharmacies, a private habit, a public fear, a political tool, a signal used to judge who belongs. The plant didn't assign itself those meanings. People did, through laws, language, and the stories they chose to repeat. And that's where I land, back at the margins, where history usually begins. A nation reveals itself in what it allows, what it punishes, and who pays the price. If you've ever wondered how a single plant could carry so many meanings, you're not alone. And this story isn't finished. If it helped you see America a little more clearly, pass it to someone who loves this country enough to question it, and stay close for the next chapter.